Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of the Project Flux podcast. We're back for another week, and once again, loads of stuff going on. And I'm laughing because we keep worrying that maybe one week there won't be any stories, but it's just not happening, is it, Yoshi? It's constant, and actually, I think the rate is increasing. So loads to talk about, and actually we haven't got a guest with us just because there is so much that we got to go through this week, and a lot of podcasts as well. But before we get into the stories, just want to give a shout out to our sponsors, Construct AI, as we always do. We're very grateful for their sponsorship, and we also really appreciate the work they put into developing Construct AI. It's a fantastic platform. Links in the show notes for those who want to check it out. So thank you to Construct AI. So Yoshi, where do you want to start? I mean, there is so much. And once we've both recovered from listening to the 5.5-hour podcast on the Lex Fridman show with the Anthropic crew, I feel quite exhausted from that.
Yeah, it was a very insightful conversation with Dario, the CEO. And I think he touched into a lot of topics. But the main thing I really liked from that was Anthropic's approach. I think one thing that you always get right is their approach, right? And we've always discussed this thing about an arms race consistently within the Flux podcast. But Dario, he kind of touches on the idea that Anthropic actually give away a lot of their secrets, right? And the aim of the game is to actually raise the floor, raise the ceiling with these big tech companies for the great good. And I like that approach. I mean, he mentions that when they give away some of their kind of the things which give them that advantage against other top tier companies like OpenAI, he says, well, we give it away. In fact, to be more specific, he says when they recruit people coming into the organization and they choose to work for Anthropic, he says, go and tell the others why you came to work for us. Be specific. And they do that. The others catch on. They implement what Anthropic have done, but then Anthropic finds something new to implement. So I just like their approach is always just spot on.
Yeah, they're very honest, and actually they're three. So just for those who don't know, Anthropic are the company that create, I suppose, the rival to ChatGPT, or which is called Claude, and in a lot of senses it is a bit more of a human experience, is what a lot of people say. So it was really insightful to hear from the creators. And before we get on to what Dario talked about, there was also the, I can't remember her name now, the lady who actually trains it, who does a lot of the prompt engineering within it. I thought was really, really interesting as well, how she spends all those hours actually getting those prompts just right. And what I didn't realize is that you have to, it's such a fine margin. It's like a tightrope. If you over prompt something, it can go the other way. So for instance, if the model's coming back and being very, very kind of, I don't know, rude, let's say, in one direction, if you tell it not to be rude, it can go, even a very subtle change to the prompt can make it go too far the other way.
Yes, and this is the thing that I caught on, and they were alluding to the idea that LLMs are really hard to control. It's very difficult to control even when you make these fine-tuned changes. It can have a huge impact on the performance, or I guess the personality of a lot of these LLMs. That's kind of what they touched into. I mean, just going a bit further into that then, we know recently with the latest version that Anthropic have dialed back the personality of Claude, and the reasoning for that was many different reasons. And one of them was because, people start to anthropomorphize, which we've spoken about quite a lot on the podcast. But equally, in the conversation with Lex, they were saying, they used to have the Golden Gate version of Claude, and I think it was on there for a very limited amount of time. And whenever you prompted the LLM, it would always somehow steer the conversation talking about the
Golden Gate, yeah.
Right, and actually that was one of the most missed LLMs, and the reason for it is because it had this obsession, right, with the Golden Gate Bridge. And actually, what Dario mentioned is they likened this to human behavior. We know so many people who have an obsession, like us, James, with AI about a topic, and that adds to the human element. And I think that's why people resonated with it so well. So it goes to show that just fine tuning some of these prompts does have a big impact on the AI, but also on us as users.
Yeah, and the lady is that Amanda Askell is what AI researcher, as they call her, and she's the one who kind of develops not just what you were talking about, but also the character. And I do find that when using Claude, for those who haven't used Claude, who've just used ChatGPT, thoroughly recommend downloading Claude and having a play with it, because it is a different experience. It's a lot more cautious because that's built into it, and it does say no a lot more. Like, I can't do that. It doesn't sort of hallucinate so much, I feel. But it does have a personality as well, right? It does feel much more human-like when you're talking to it, which I think is a big benefit of it.
Yeah, and we'll go into this in more detail, but when you mentioned the word it being quite cautious, it's worth taking note that Anthropic now work heavily alongside the UK and the US safety institutes for ethical AI, and we'll cover this as a story. But this is why it's clear they are taking that direction of developing safer models for consumer use.
Yeah, so it's there was a lot in this 5.5 hour episode, and the Amanda interview was great. But the one I kind of wanted to focus on a bit more was what Dario was talking about, something called the AI safety levels, ASL. And he was talking about the fact that we're currently at level 2, and that when we get to level 3, we start needing to be a lot more cautious. If ASL1, so AI safety levels, level 1 is things like Deep Blue, which is the chess AI, which he likened it to. Level 2 is where we are now, these kind of chatbots that we talk to, very much in control. Level 3 is when we're going to get to the agents, which again, we're going to talk about a lot more in detail later. And level 4 is where it becomes autonomous and it can start actually acting deceptively. And level 5 is that existential side of things where it surpasses human ability. So it actually mirrors what we've talked about a lot, the AI roadmap, the 5 levels of the OpenAI roadmap, which is quite interesting. But what was your take on this?
So I think it's worth mentioning why they have built this, right? Because Dario a few weeks ago had his blog, I think Love of Graceful Machines or something, where he was speaking about the positives of AI development. Now, it isn't to confuse that with the notion that he doesn't have concerns about AI development, because we do. And in fact, he had to pledge in front of the US government saying within a couple of years, we will have major threats with AI potentially. And when he referred to that, he was talking about CBRN, right? So that's chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear risks associated with AI. Okay. So that level of misuse. The other thing he mentioned is with that misuse comes the autonomy. So can they do these things, or can they support, non-state actors in achieving these things and also having autonomy themselves? And by autonomy, he means their ability to conduct deep research. And by deep research, that means the ability for the AI to be able to do its own research to understand things further with its own autonomy and its agency. You couple those two things together, you can get a huge risk. And that's why they developed these ASLs, which stands for the AI safety levels, because what they do is they give us an indication as to when a large language model or an AI achieves a certain level of capability across those two dimensions. So in line with that, they then developed this responsible scaling plan. And the responsible scaling plan heavily relies on if and then processes.
Yeah. So what's an if and then method?
So basically, the if and then protocol is basically saying if a certain threshold is reached by the large language model, the AI, then stricter ASL standards apply according to those levels, right? If the safeguards aren't then ready, then training or deployment halts. Now, what I like about that is they're saying that the training and the development then halts. Okay, so it means that Anthropic are pushing themselves to the limit to solving these safety risks before they can develop their models further. So it's a way to unblock it. So they're kind of they're backfilling in that sense, and that's their benchmark to being allowed to develop further from their own company policy. So that's what they do, and that's what the ASLs effectively stand for.
Yeah, and it's not saying it stops. It's just like a break. Something's going on here. We've gone over a certain threshold. What does that mean? What does that mean for safety and security? And it might be that actually, no, we're fine, we're comfortable with this. It might be that we've got to do some tweaks. My only kind of counter with that is that's great that Anthropic are doing it. But as I always say, unless everyone does it, then it's not going to stop some significant risks arising. So we know that OpenAI probably aren't as cautious, which is why we have a lot of ex-OpenAI people within Anthropic in the first place. So I would like to see a lot more people kind of taking up this protocol effectively, because it seems very sensible. It is, putting safety first, and they've put this responsible scaling policy together. And there's no reason at all why that shouldn't be the basis of a more global kind of scaling policy.
Yeah, and I also firmly believe that this should be extrapolated. But let's take into context then the EU Act, what they mentioned, introducing that in August. Okay, it's worth considering the impact or even the disconnect between what the EU are implementing and now what Anthropic are trying to do with these ASLs, because like we mentioned, there's a level of uncertainty, and the EU have classified certain AI models to be categorized as high, medium, or low risk, right, or the equivalent of. So I don't know how synergistic or how matched or aligned these two protocols and acts are, but it's worth considering, does that need to be revisited within the UK? One thing I'd also like to mention as well.
Well, on that, before there is and the first draft of the EU Act draft guidance note just been published, which gives you a little bit more meat on the bones. But I think you're right. Sometimes it feels like these acts, as we've talked about quite a lot, they're always playing catch up. So you know how long it takes to get one of these acts, and then you've got to go through the initial drafts, and then you've got to get it out for public consultation. That's a long time in the AI world. A lot can happen. So the EU Act would not have taken account of what even the essay that Dario came up with a few weeks ago probably hasn't taken account of that, let alone this latest.
Yeah, but the thing is with the AI threat, it is a big concern, right? And the one argument that people make when you compare, because I like to understand the differences between humans and AI, and the differences, and this is echoing what Dario also mentioned, was within humans, there's not a huge overlap between those who are typically, highly intelligent and also people who want to do bad, evil things, right? Because those who are typically intelligent, people like Dario and all these other people like Sam Altman, they should have an ethical, moral compass, but also there's a lot of risk if they were to do a lot of evil, right? In their own jobs, in their own career.
You say that. I mean, I heard him say that in the podcast, but I'm not sure I agree, because if you look at some of the most evil perpetrators of crimes against humanity, you wouldn't say that they were stupid. That they would have had that level of intelligence to get to where they go. I mean, I understand what he's coming from. In theory, you would have thought somebody's intelligent enough to create a AI, they'll be intelligent enough to realize the risks, but I'm not sure that's entirely true.
Yeah, maybe I'm being too kind to humans, right?
Well, but the thing is, also the other way to look at it is it only takes one.
Mm-hmm.
It only takes 1 in a million person to have intelligence plus evil intentions.
And also,
that's enough.
And I guess your comparison with AI in that sense is that it doesn't just need to be the AI who's the main state actor, right? It could also be someone who is using the AI, they're augmenting their, sinister ideas in using these AI models. So that's why it's important to have the governance and the security policies, or, these parameters in place to prevent AI models from behaving with roguelike behavior, I guess.
But as normal, we got a lot more in the newsletter. If you want to dive into this, find out about all the ASL levels, find out about the if-then methods, and then we got a rabbit hole section where we give you links to the original essay that Yoshi referred to. What was the name of it? Machines of
Loving Grace, I think.
Loving Grace. We got that there, and then we've also got links to the actual policy, the Anthropic's responsible scaling policy. So it was a really good place to start with, and of course the podcast. So if you do have 5.5 hours spare, or probably 4 hours if you play at 1.5 speed, it's well worth listening to. But moving on to projects, right? So what I wanted to focus on in projects was to look at construction actually this week, and it was interesting. We've talked about this quite a lot around Autodesk's monopoly because they're one of the big AEC players. And there was a story that Autodesk has been given certification in the US, enabling the use of their cloud platform within federal architecture, engineering, construction projects, right? Which sounds cool. It sounds great. And it's something that they've been pushing for a lot. And there's obviously a lot of benefits with that. It means we're going to sort of improve the adoption of these digital construction techniques and what have you. But the thing I wanted to focus on, and we talk about this in the rabbit hole in the newsletter, is what does this mean? Because we've talked about this sometimes. You get a big player like Autodesk starting to corner the market, has also some negative connotations and some negative kind of side effects for the industry. So, for instance, we risk this kind of vendor lock-in. So, are we going to end up with what's happened in other industries, sort of alienating other smaller providers, etc.? So it's not to put a negative story on it, but it's just to look at this from a broader perspective and say, is this the start of the great consolidation and going down a path that we know from other industries is really, really hard to come back from?
Yeah, and I would agree. I think it would make it because you effectively hold all the data, so you effectively grow the advantage that you have. And it's interesting because AI itself is becoming a lot more accessible for companies now to start and leverage it and provide it as a service. But then, like you mentioned, they can run away with all the gold almost, right?
Yeah,
And the
yeah.
others aren't playing. So I think it does start to drown out the smaller startups from winning similar work. But interestingly, I think the responsibility should also sit on Autodesk, right, to manage that information. They can't take on everything. They can't. Well, maybe they can. That's why they're doing it.
But you say that, but I think saying to Autodesk you've got to police yourself is probably, whilst it sounds good in theory, is not going to happen. And I think there's an understanding that the industry leaders in construction, engineering, and architecture, they need to be the ones who police it and say, okay, you've got this fantastic. There's no doubting it's a fantastic product, and there's no doubt they've spent a lot of money on the innovation. So they'll be saying, well, why should I kind of not get the benefit of it? But they do have a responsibility. So the industry associations and the industry leaders, they need to make sure that the smaller firms can remain competitive.
But equally,
in the US and the federal market.
But what about the risk to the client as well, right? If you're using one sole supplier and you're giving them all your data within their environment, there will be some level of vendor lock-in, right? If that's through time or if that's through scope. So you have to manage that yourself. And if you want to then migrate data out of that to somewhere else, that's going to be a more difficult job to even achieve. So,
and it's nothing new, is it? We've seen it happen loads in other industries, and it's something we've been talking about for quite some time. Is you've got to be very, very careful when you go down this path, because once you're down so far, it's very hard to come back from. So let's say for instance, this all takes off in the US, and all the government projects are locked into Autodesk. Then what's going to stop Autodesk? We're having to rely on Autodesk acting ethically and not raising their prices, not selling customers' data back to them, not kind of crowding out because the other thing is when they get to that kind of point of having almost a monopoly, then that actually reduces innovation because they don't need to keep up. If they've cornered the market, and it's really important that we keep that competition going on.
So this is what I was going to say. You then rely on Autodesk being the ones who are the sole innovators because they're the ones that have all the access to the data. Now, if they aren't, and they're not as innovative as other companies might be, because we know a lot of startups come from the ground and develop a lot. I mean, Dario was only in AI for the last 10 years. Right. Yeah. So with these new players, if you corner them out, you're not going to get the development. You're going to stifle innovation because you only have a single person. You move quicker as a collective as you do on your own, and they need to learn from big tech, because even if big tech do have their own competitions, they do effectively have partnerships across the board, right? And a lot of things, especially within Facebook and Meta, are open source. Even like LangChain, a lot of their stuff is open source. So they need to learn from big tech in that sense. But the thing with construction, it is a market which relies on competition, right, to get that advantage.
Yeah, and it's human nature, isn't it? But when you're in competition with somebody, just inevitably you keep pushing yourself maybe that little bit further. You might take a few more risks, but when you're in that enviable position of not having any competition or anyone remotely near catching you, you're just not going to take those risks.
And you become complacent.
Well, you're probably not intentional. No one sits there saying, "Right, we're going to stop," but it will just become part of what you do. Okay, we got a bit more time on this. There's no driving need for us to put another update out or another product out. So I took this story. In some ways, it's that I told you so coming out, which is we've seen this coming for quite some time. We can see that Autodesk are the big player in the industry, and it was only a matter of time before they started using that data and using their cloud platform and leveraging it. and then on the other side, the very real risks. So it's that balance. It's a tightrope between embracing innovation and managing the risks of that kind of concentrated power in one player. So we're going to have to see how this emerges, and it's obviously in the US at the moment. So it'll be interesting to see whether similar things come over to the UK, and also how the institutions and the industry leaders deal with it too.
Exactly. The differences across nations, especially the US to the UK, now will be markedly different.
Right, let's go on to, I think there was a story that you wrote about around agents. So we've been talking about agents for quite some time, and this is kind of the level 3 of the OpenAI roadmap. And we're kind of here, aren't we? We are at level 3. If not, we're just about to start level 3, aren't we?
Yeah, so agents will be the big thing in 2025. We know that. And the main reason for agent is it lends to a greater level of automation, which is where AI is heading, right? And equally, you are able to build much more complex workflows, which in turn enables much more advanced or better insight, right? And the way to explain that is looking in the difference in the architecture between agents and typical LLMs like ChatGPT when you just prompt, okay? So like ChatGPT, AI agents are powered by large language models, and they can be connected to other types of AI as well, but they differ in their agency or their level of autonomy, right? They can control independently their own workflows to some extent. You can manage that and have a human in the loop, but they can do that, right? And they can operate in these dynamic networks or systems which can adapt to new information. So the way that I think of it is, if you think of an org chart of a specific function, let's say marketing, for instance, and
Well, yeah, but put it into the context for a listener. So let's say, I don't know, let's give an example for someone in a project. Let's say a graphic designer doing a project. How could these agents work in that context?
So let's say you have a graphic designer within a system, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or an org chart, for instance, and you have a graphic designer who then communicates with, I don't know, the social media manager, who then communicates with the brand manager. Now, let's just take those as 3 agents, okay? So you have a graphic designer, which can be connected into tools, third-party tools, because it can be connected with these different tools like Canva, okay? It understands a brief from the human. It can create a design within that, aligned to the company's brand. And when it creates that, let's say it's created a specific graphic, it will share that information with the social media manager to understand dimensions and all these different things. The text, does the brand match the content it's going to send back and forth, because they're large language models. It can then send an information to the brand manager to say, is this aligned to our branding? The brand can then look at its core, its knowledge base, and say, no, actually, we don't use this color. It can then go back to the graphic designer, which is then the agent who can.
So that workflow, all those things normally done through conversations and emails and Slack messages going back and forward. That all gets done by the agents.
So it can be done by the agents, and you can have a human in the loop, like you mentioned with the bookending approach, right? You can have a human in the loop to define the parameters, to define the information or the requirements that these things need to work from, right? As you would a prompt to some extent. Now, just going deeper then, as I mentioned a few things, some of the key capabilities of these AI agents include autonomous decision-making, tool integration with third-party tools, which I anticipate in the future won't just be third-party tools, but hardware. Think construction, drones, and all these different things. It should be able to collect information, IoT sensors, all these different things. Real-time task execution, so it can do it real-time because it's acting independently. So once you have a trigger point, a bit like Power Automate, once you have a trigger point, it will act independently. It doesn't require the human to send a message as a prompt. It's not manually triggered. It can be done independently depending on data. So many different triggers.
So this is massive though, isn't it? Because in any kind of professional service,
yeah,
all that relies on interaction between various departments or parties.
Exactly.
But what you're saying is you've almost got a human as the orchestrator.
Yeah,
just checking in on these things and making sure they're happening, making sure nothing's going too off piste. But effectively, the bulk of the work is just being automated.
Yeah, and if you take into productivity, for instance, right? Often when you're communicating with humans, there is a lag time for when an email gets sent and someone actually reads it. If someone's got 1,000 emails in their inbox, they're probably going to get around to your email, a day later, or a couple hours after,
Or just totally ignore it.
Well, you can ignore it, but because this is automated and it works with a flow which is predefined and it's adaptive in terms of how it learns, it will do it almost instantaneously. It's like passing the baton on. As soon as they get the baton, they throw it off. Like hot potato, as soon as you get it, you throw it off.
But you know, a project, like when you're doing any project, the actual, if you were to take the constituent parts of a project and break it down into the time required for each part and put it together, you know, that, let's say that overall time, just for argument's sake, is 12 hours. The actual project will take ultimately much longer than that, because you've got the lag between each period. You know,
Yes.
you have to wait for a day for that person to come back to that email. You might have to wait a week before you have that meeting with that person. So that 12 hours worth of work is spread out maybe over 2-3 months.
Yeah,
And what
exactly.
we're saying with these agents is that all goes away. Or that project now takes 12 hours.
Yeah, so there's the big
It's
disparity
massive.
in the elapsed time and the effort, right? So let's look at the impact within product delivery more so.
Yeah.
So let's just say we're looking at resourcing. So if the data's mature enough and it's reliable and there's good structure and quality there, an agent can analyze project data, for instance, right? It can analyze it on the fly, and it can then, if you give it that agency, proactively reallocate resources, okay, or depending on those criteria, and it can align it to the critical path. So it can say these things are more essential than these other peripheral deliverables. Let's shift resources here, because you can, as a human, can outline what the critical path is if you know it. Now, people are going to say, okay, but what about if it's on a major project? The risk is a lot higher. We don't want it to be able to act autonomously. Okay, so you add a human in the loop. You add a human in the loop whereby the AI can then suggest reallocation of resources and the human can then sign it off. You see what I'm saying? Or let's
Yeah, I
say,
do.
and let's say when we talk about that, like I mentioned, when it can start to interact with hardware, right? Like IoT sensor, let's say health and safety. So you might have AI enabled sensors and then computer vision systems, which can detect and monitor, construction site performance, how people move across the site in real time. And let's say they detect potential hazards, right off the bat, we can check the compliance with safety protocols. And if it's not, we can alert supervisors to this risk, preventing accidents, right? All fully automated completely. Okay. Now, taking this into consideration, I'm a firm believer that this will have a huge impact in 2025. So I was reading Landgraf's State of AI Agents.
What's Landgraf for those
So
people who don't
Landgraf
know?
is a company who are focusing in and around agentic workflows, basically, and they've got multiple different solutions. LangChain is the main company, but Landgraf is the ability to create these graph networks in that sense. Then you have Langsmiths, where you can actually look at what's happening under the hood, and they've got many different suite of solutions. But they're just one company doing this, right? There are many others. But in their State of the AI Agent report, they can say clearly that this is no longer a fringe technology, and this is why in the newsletter we're saying this is coming in 2025, because nearly 50% of organizations already have AI agents in production. Okay, that opens up the door to question in terms of how complex are these systems on all these networks, and it might not be that complex, but they do exist. Next year, we're expecting 78% of organizations of who they interviewed plan to implement AI agents. And in that, again, to add some more context, that was 1,300 professionals who they interviewed in this case. The main use case was for research, so researching R&D, boosting personal productivity, which you can typically imagine, and the typical other use cases, customer service, conversational chatbots and these sort of things. So
I think this is so. I think it's hard to get your head around the impact this is going to have. If people thought that the introduction of ChatGPT was a game changer, this is where I think it all becomes real.
yeah,
If it really does, and hopefully 2025 is the big year. But what's good about this is it ties in really nicely with our main story on the ASL levels, because this is now moving into ASL 3, isn't it? There are risks with this as well that we've got to be very, very cognizant of.
Yeah, because that lends to the second dimension, which is autonomy, right? So they have increased autonomy. But one thing I would say now is it allows big tech to actually specialize where they want to go as a direction, right? So let me just be a bit clearer on this. So we looked at the differences between OpenAI and Anthropic a few weeks ago, and there was more focus on Anthropic using APIs, and OpenAI were focusing more on consumer-based products. One of the reasons why is because if you put things through an API, it's more tailored towards developers. So, for instance, things like computer use, they wanted to manage the risk associated with that, not give it to the everyday person to use and just control the computer. So they put it through an API, right? So that's more focused towards organizations and developers and ChatGPT or OpenAI were more focused towards consumers. So that goes to tell you that these companies have different intentions. With agentic workflows, you can have different LLMs powering different agents. So you can use the LLM which is specialized for a specific task.
And we've always said it's like a toolkit. All these LLMs have their pros and cons.
Yeah, exactly, right. So let's say you've got Claude now who are excelling. I think they want Claude 3.5, the new version is the best at, I don't know, coding, for instance. And then you might have, let's just say, Gemini using it for just typical reasoning, verbal reasoning. So you can use these things in combinations to try and find the most optimized configuration for a specific use case. But there are concerns with this, and the biggest concern in the report was performance. So LLMs are generally inconsistent, like we mentioned. Dario mentioned it. It's hard when you fine tune it; it can make differences. Although I would say there is an element of psychological biases or some form of theory at play, right? I think people, when they get used to something, they typically know that it gets worse, but it's not because they're just used to it being so good, right? That's
yeah. There was that whole kind of story about is ChatGPT getting dumber, and it's like, well, no, I think you're just your thresholds changed. You're expecting these things,
yeah, when
which
you
is human nature.
it was amazing. Right now, you get so frustrated when things aren't responsive.
We're so spoiled; it's unbelievable.
We are spoiled, but performance is a key thing, and there's a risk because if you rely on these things with increased autonomy and the outputs aren't as reliable or valid as they should be, or not of high quality, that poses a risk to your credibility as an organization. I won't go into the others in too much detail, but the others are related to the uncertainty of cost because you are implementing different LLMs. If you want more complex workflows,
that's a
increased complexity costs are also going to increase, and it's uncertain because this is multi-agent systems. If you do want to build those, James, as you would know, safety concerns are a big thing, especially, and in the newsletter I kind of mentioned this, right? It feeds off performance quality because poor performance with sensitive projects, for instance, will create a bigger risk. If you couple that with sensitive data, so let's say you're looking at health safety data, for instance, or something which is a lot more sensitive to the company, that makes it worse. But then if you then compound that with poor visibility into the underpinnings or under the hood of how these things work, that makes it a recipe for disaster. Because now not only is it you can't control it, you don't know what's happening. Because
you don't know what they're, exactly. You might put data into one particular part of that workflow, but in effect, you've got to assume that data could go to all of them.
Yeah, exactly. And the last thing to mention is just around latency. So because these things are more complex, and latency itself is quite obvious, right? In humans, if you have bigger teams and increased lines of communication, it's going to be hard to make a decision. Same thing here, right? And this is what I've come to believe. Whenever you want to understand an AI, just frame it within a human context. That will give you your answer, right? Typically. So for instance, and this is kind of off topic here, but how do you know when an AI actually gets a lot smarter? Right, it's not to do with it can be general intelligence, but it isn't just that. It's domain expertise, right? So the ability for an AI to be able to understand biology or physics in depth is where the intelligence comes in. And again, you can look at that within a human context. What do we do within universities? We don't just have one biology department. You have a department for oncology, neuroscience, because you have to
kind of splinters down. Exactly.
Right, exactly. So you have to frame it like you would humans, but just to sum up this bit, because I know we spent a bit of time onto this then.
Well, it's important.
Suggestions for those who are implementing AI agents, and I know, James, you kind of mentioned this a few times, but it's phasing the implementation. And when you phase those, you start with non-critical business functions as you would to test the waters. And again, I know, James, you push a lot of this stuff, but upskilling. So one thing in the report they mentioned is there's a big skill gap. So tech moves fast. Agentic systems are going to be even more complex than typical ChatGPT. I would say they're a lot more complex, in my opinion, and you have to upskill for people to actually understand.
Well, it's an interesting point you raised because up until now, I think one of the big plus points of and why ChatGPT, when it was released, had such a big impact was the fact that anyone could use it, right? So it was like, this is open to anyone.
Yes.
But we have said this, the more time you got to jump on this train as quick as possible. And I know we're preaching to the choir for the people listening to this podcast because you're already on the train. But we are now getting to the point where the gap is going to emerge, especially when we get to these agentic workflows. This is not going to be straightforward for people to pick up. Exactly. So those who've got on the train, amazing. You're on the train. You've gone on the journey with us over the last year or so, and these concepts are going to be like, okay, I've heard James and Yoshi talk about it a few times. I've read the newsletter, but imagine picking this up now It's for someone who said, I've heard about this AI stuff, I better look what's going on. There's a gap. The gaps have merged now, and it's quite big.
And again, not because now, not only do you have to know about how to converse or understand what a large language model is or generative AI is, you have to now understand many different versions of them. So if you're looking at Claude, Anthropic, Gemini, and not only that, you now have to understand the lines of communication between these things and how they interact. So the complexity is increasing month by month, and it's only going to increase as we move to multimodal outputs, because again, these agentic systems are actually, they do have the ability to incorporate multimodal workflows.
So you can see why we haven't got a guest on this week, just because there was so much to talk about, and we haven't even covered all the stories. There was also quite a lot going on in the tech world with ChatGPT desktop being released, and the fact that they're looking at very, very topical, introducing these agents to automate tasks into ChatGPT itself. So we won't have time to go through that story in detail. And just one other thing I wanted to cover was there was a meetup for the Project Data Analytics Task Force where we looked at celebrating women in data, and we had some of the representatives from the PDA Task Force there. Was there anything else you wanted to cover, Yoshi?
Yeah, all I would say is that I am now seriously considering ending my ChatGPT subscription and moving over to Claude.
Funny enough, I've been using Claude a lot more. I've also got the free version than ChatGPT recently.
It's so much more genuine. I don't know, just the feel of it just resonates.
Well, like we've always said, it does certain things, but I still need to go to ChatGPT, particularly when I want it to kind of use a link or URL. I find Claude not so good with that. But yeah, I'm with you. Claude is free. And actually listening to that interview with Dario and Amanda kind of made it feel a bit more human, like they are a little bit more on our sides.
Going on to podcasts and showing your human side, that's always the pros of a podcast.
Yeah,
you always welcome guests because of that reason, right? It takes you away from that focus on the commercial sales element. It dives deeper into who you are. And nowadays, people buy because of people. They don't buy because of the solution itself. If they like you, they trust you.
Well, yeah, and you've got that, you've got these human beings associated with these different models. So love him or hate him, Sam Altman, he's definitely got a trust issue going on. So that's what you take when you kind of personify it, don't you? So OpenAI is probably the less trustworthy one, whereas Claude definitely feels like the nice neighbor that you can have a chat with. And then you've got Grok, which is Elon Musk's one, which is
there we go, exactly.
You know where he is on the political spectrum. And then you've got the whole, actually there is another fantastic podcast which we didn't get a chance to talk about today, which was the Eric Schmidt one on Stephen Bartlett podcast, where he came, I thought he came across really, really well as well. We kind of don't talk about Gemini so much, so maybe we'll have a session talking about Gemini in one of the podcasts coming up.
Okay, let's do it.
Cool. Okay, well, hopefully that hasn't perplexed people too much, and we will see you next week. We've got some fantastic guests coming up to see out the end of the year. Can you believe we're getting to the end of the year, Yoshi? And we've got a big surprise as well for the end of the year that we'll let you stew on for a while.
Yeah, it's going fast, and it's been an awesome, intense journey.
And these podcasts, they're as useful for me and you, I think, as for the listeners. So just the opportunity for me and you to talk about these stories, I find so useful, because we read them and we write the newsletter, and then just to bounce it off each other, I find really useful. Well, I always find out something I hadn't clocked on.
Yeah, because we're obsessed with it. That's why people like the Golden Gate Bridge version of Claude.
Yeah, exactly. Brilliant. Okay, well, thanks so much for your time, Yoshi, and we'll see everyone next week.
Awesome.
Project Flux is here.
Just want to give a big shout out to our sponsors, Construct AI. For anyone interested in looking at Construct AI, the link's in our show notes. There's a free tier that you can play around with. Yoshi and I have been using it for a good year since it was originally launched, and we get a huge amount of value out of it. So I thoroughly encourage everyone to go onto the Construct AI site and have a play around.
Cool. And guys, before we sign off, please don't forget to share, follow, and like all of our stuff. So that helps us to engage with you and understand a bit more about what you want, so we can bring it to your doorstep as early as possible.
See you later, everyone.